Hey guys, tonight we begin with Queen Victoria's DNA killing Europe's royal heirs and toppling empires. While you might imagine royal bloodlines as symbols of power, the reality was one genetic mutation bleeding through her descendants, destroying princes and monarchies alike. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture yourself as Queen Victoria in 1853, sitting by the bedside of your 8-year-old son Leopold. He is bleeding again, this time from a minor bump to his knee, but the bleeding won't stop. It has been hours. The royal physicians are baffled. Your son is pale, crying in pain as his knee joint swells to twice its normal size, filling with blood that has nowhere to go. You are watching your child suffer from something you don't understand, something you'll later discover came from you, something that will echo through European royalty for generations and help destroy empires. You are about to become the unwitting carrier of what historians will call the royal disease, though you'll never know you carry it until it is far too late. Let me show you exactly what is happening inside Leopold's body, because understanding the medical reality makes the tragedy more visceral. Leopold has haemophilia B, also called Christmas disease, though in the Victorian era it was simply called the bleeding disease. His blood is missing a crucial clotting factor, factor X, a protein that is essential for blood to clot normally. According to research by Dr. David Lillicrap at Queen's University, haemophilia B is caused by a mutation in the F9 gene located on the X chromosome. Here is why that chromosomal location matters desperately. Women have 2 X chromosomes, so if one carries the mutation, the other can usually compensate. The woman becomes a carrier but doesn't have symptoms. Men have only 1 X chromosome paired with a Y. So if that single X carries the mutation, there is no backup. They have full-blown haemophilia. You, as Victoria, are a carrier. You gave Leopold your mutated X chromosome, and because he is male, he has no second X to protect him. You've condemned your son to a life of pain, and you don't even know it yet. Leopold's bleeding episodes are horrifying to witness. A small bump or bruise that would be nothing to a healthy child becomes a medical crisis. Blood leaks into his joints, his knees, elbows, ankles, causing excruciating pain and swelling. These bleeds damage the joint tissue over time, causing arthritis and disability. Internal bleeding in his muscles creates massive bruises, deep purple spreading under his skin. Bleeding in his mouth or nose can last for hours or days. A minor dental procedure could kill him. The worst terror is the possibility of brain hemorrhage. Any blow to the head, even a minor one, could cause bleeding inside his skull that would be impossible to stop with Victorian medicine. You live in constant fear that Leopold will fall, will hit his head, will die before your eyes, and there will be nothing you can do. And you are right to be terrified. Leopold will die at age 30 from a brain hemorrhage after a minor fall. But before we get to his death, we need to understand where this mutation came from, because this is where the story becomes truly fascinating and disturbing. You, Victoria, are almost certainly the source of the mutation. Your parents didn't have haemophilia. Your uncles didn't have it. There is no family history. According to genetic research by Dr. William Shull at the University of Texas, the mutation likely arose spontaneously in you, or possibly in your mother, a random copying error during DNA replication that created a new mutation in the F9 gene. It is estimated that about 1/3 of haemophilia cases arise from spontaneous mutations, rather than being inherited. So you are not just a carrier of an inherited defect, you are the origin point. The mutation started with you, or possibly with your mother in the egg cell that became you. From that single copying error, a cascade of suffering will spread across Europe, affecting dozens of royal children, destabilizing governments, contributing to the fall of monarchies, all from one tiny genetic accident in your DNA or your mother's. But you don't know any of this in 1853. Genetics doesn't exist yet as a science. Gregor Mendel won't publish his work on inheritance until 1866, and it won't be widely understood until 1900. The structure of DNA won't be discovered until 1953, a full century after Leopold's birth. You are watching your son bleed and you have no framework to understand why. No way to predict which of your other children might be affected. No way to warn your daughters what they might be carrying. Let's talk about the other children you'll have, and which ones inherited the mutation, because this is where the curse begins to spread. You'll have 9 children total: Victoria, Edward, Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and Beatrice. Leopold, as we've discussed, has haemophilia. He is the visible proof that something is wrong. But 3 of your daughters, Alice, Helena, and Beatrice, are carriers like you, though you won't know this until they start having children of their own. Here is where it gets mathematically cruel. Each time you, as a carrier, have a child, there is a 50% chance you'll pass on the mutated X chromosome. If you have a daughter, there is a 50% chance she'll be a carrier like you. If you have a son, there is a 50% chance he'll have haemophilia. You had 5 daughters and 4 sons. Statistically, you'd expect about 2 carriers and 2 haemophiliacs. You got 3 carriers and 1 haemophiliac, slightly worse than average luck. But the real damage isn't in your children, it is in your grandchildren and great-grandchildren, because your carrier daughters married into the royal houses of Europe, and they took the mutation with them. Alice married Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse. Helena married Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein. Beatrice married Prince Henry of Battenberg. Through these marriages, the haemophilia mutation spread to Germany, Russia, and Spain. You were the grandmother of Europe in more ways than one. You gave them a shared genetic heritage that would destroy them. Let me introduce you to your granddaughter Alexandra, because her story is perhaps the most historically significant and personally tragic of all the carriers. Alexandra is Alice's daughter, which means she had a 50% chance of being a carrier. She was. In 1894, Alexandra married Nicholas II, who would become the last Tsar of Russia. She became Alexandra Feodorovna, Empress of Russia, one of the most powerful women in the world, and she was carrying your mutation. Alexandra and Nicholas desperately wanted a son, an heir to the Romanov throne. They had 4 daughters first: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia. Beautiful, healthy girls, but not heirs under Russian succession law. Finally, in 1904, Alexandra gave birth to a son, Alexei Nikolaevich, the long-awaited Tsarevich. The entire Russian Empire celebrated. Bells rang across the nation. Te Deums were sung in cathedrals. Russia had an heir. 6 weeks later, Alexandra noticed something wrong. The baby was bleeding from his umbilical cord stump, bleeding that wouldn't stop. The blood soaked through his diapers, his clothes, his bedding. The doctors were baffled. They tried everything they knew: pressure, bandages, cauterization. Nothing worked. The bleeding continued for days. The baby nearly died. When Alexei was a few months old, he had another bleeding episode, this time from his mouth, then another from a minor bruise. The pattern was unmistakable. Alexandra knew her son had haemophilia. She recognized it because her own brother Friedrich had died of it at age 3, bleeding to death after a fall. Her uncle, Leopold, your son, had died of it. She knew exactly what this diagnosis meant for Alexei and for herself. According to Alexandra's letters preserved in the Russian State Archive, she was devastated by guilt. She wrote to her sister, "I have given the heir of Russia a terrible disease. It is my fault. I have failed in my most sacred duty." The guilt consumed her. She saw Alexei's haemophilia as divine punishment for some sin, some failure on her part. She became obsessed with protecting him, with hiding his condition from the Russian public, with finding any cure or treatment that might save him. You need to understand what daily life was like for Alexandra and Alexei, because the medical reality of childhood haemophilia in the early 1900s was a nightmare. Alexei couldn't play like normal children. He couldn't run, couldn't roughhouse, couldn't do any of the physical activities boys his age loved. He had to be constantly supervised. His every movement was watched by attendants, whose job was to prevent any injury. Despite all precautions, bleeding episodes still happened. A bump from playing too enthusiastically, a slight fall, sometimes spontaneous bleeds with no apparent cause. His factor IX levels were so low that even normal blood pressure could cause blood to leak into his joints. According to medical records analyzed by Dr. Evgeny Pechelov at the Russian State University for the Humanities, Alexei experienced major bleeding crises, approximately every 2 to 3 months, each one potentially fatal. The worst episode happened in 1912 when Alexei was 8 years old. The family was at their hunting lodge in Spafia, Poland. Alexei jumped into a boat and bumped his upper thigh on the side. It seemed minor, but the bump caused bleeding deep in his thigh muscle, creating a massive hematoma. The blood had nowhere to go, so it built up pressure on the femoral artery, cutting off blood flow to his leg. Alexei was in agony. He screamed for days. The pain was so severe that he begged his mother to let him die. His leg was grotesquely swollen, the skin stretched tight and purple. Doctors feared they would have to amputate to save his life. But amputation on a haemophiliac was essentially a death sentence. He'd bleed out during surgery. Alexandra stayed at his bedside for 11 days, barely sleeping, praying constantly, watching her son writhe in pain. The Russian court issued bulletins preparing the nation for the Tsarevich's death. A priest gave Alexei last rites. The boy drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes begging for death, sometimes delirious with fever from infection setting into the massive bruise. And this is where Grigory Rasputin enters the story, because desperate mothers in impossible situations will turn to anyone who offers hope. Rasputin was a Siberian mystic who had somehow gained influence over Alexandra. He claimed to have healing powers. When Alexei was dying in Spasa, with doctors unable to help, Alexandra sent a telegram to Rasputin, begging for help. Rasputin sent a telegram back. "The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much." And improbably, Alexei began to improve. The bleeding stopped. The pain eased. The swelling gradually reduced. Within weeks, Alexei was recovering. What happened? Modern medical analysis suggests Rasputin's advice to stop the doctors from bothering Alexei actually helped. Victorian medical treatment for bleeding often made haemophilia worse. Doctors would manipulate the injured area, apply pressure that could restart bleeding, or give aspirin which thins blood. By telling Alexandra to leave Alexei alone and let him rest quietly, Rasputin may have inadvertently provided the best possible treatment, minimal disturbance and natural healing. But Alexandra didn't see it that way. She saw a miracle. She became convinced that Rasputin had divine power to save her son. This belief would have catastrophic political consequences. Alexandra's dependence on Rasputin alienated the Russian aristocracy, who saw him as a crude peasant with inappropriate influence over the empress. When World War I began and Nicholas was away commanding troops, Alexandra relied on Rasputin for advice on governing. Rasputin's influence over government appointments and policy decisions enraged the nobility and contributed to the erosion of the monarchy's credibility. According to historian Dr. Orlando Fidges at Birkbeck College, Alexandra's obsession with Rasputin, driven by her desperate need to protect her haemophiliac son, was a significant factor in the Russian Revolution. The aristocracy and public saw the empress as irrational, possibly treasonous, influenced by a mad monk. When the revolution came in 1917, the Romanovs had lost the support of the very people they needed to survive. The entire family, Nicholas Alexandra, Their 5 children, including Alexei, were executed by Bolsheviks in 1918. Alexei was 13 years old when he was shot in that basement in Ekaterinburg. His hemophilia, your mutation, had created the conditions for his death and his family's death and the fall of the Russian Empire. Now, let's travel to Spain. Because your curse wasn't finished with Russia. Your youngest daughter, Beatrice, also a carrier, married Prince Henry of Battenberg. Their daughter, Victoria Eugenie, called Enna, was a carrier too. Though Beatrice didn't know it when Enna married King Alfonso XIII of Spain in 1906. Enna became Queen of Spain, young and beautiful, and completely unaware she was carrying a genetic time bomb. Enna and Alfonso's first son, Alfonso, Prince of Asturias, was born in 1907. Within months, it was clear he had hemophilia. Their family physician, Dr. Gregorio Marin, documented the diagnosis and the family's reaction. According to Dr. Marin's memoir, when Alfonso realized his heir had hemophilia and that Ina had brought this disease to the Spanish royal family, he was furious. He blamed Ina completely, even though the genetics weren't her fault and weren't something she could have known. The marriage, which had begun with genuine affection, deteriorated into cold hostility. Alfonso openly took mistresses and flaunted them. Enna was isolated, blamed for contaminating Spanish royal blood. She had 7 children total, and 2 of her sons, Alfonso and Gonzalo, had hemophilia. Both would die young from bleeding complications. Young Alfonso, despite his hemophilia, tried to live as normally as possible. In 1938, at age 31, he was driving with his sister when he had a minor car accident. The impact caused internal bleeding. He died within hours. His brother Gonzalo had died even younger, at 19 after a minor car accident caused a fatal hemorrhage. 2 sons dead from your mutation. Inés' marriage destroyed. The Spanish royal family's genetic integrity questioned. According to research by Spanish historian Dr. Javier Rubio, the hemophilia in the Spanish royal family contributed to political instability. The heir to the throne was sickly and might not survive to rule. The king was distracted by his son's illness and his bitterness toward his wife. The Spanish monarchy was already weak, and the hemophilia crisis didn't help. When Spain became a republic in 1931, the contaminated bloodline was one of many factors that had eroded monarchical legitimacy. Let me take you back to you, Victoria, because you lived long enough to know what your mutation was doing to your descendants. Leopold died in 1884 when you were 65. You mourned him but didn't yet understand the pattern. Then your grandson Friedrich of Hesse, Alice's son, died of hemophilia in 1873 at age 3. Your great-grandson, Waldemar of Prussia, Helena's grandson, died of hemophilia in 1945 at age 56 after a minor car accident. By the time you died in 1901, you'd seen enough hemophilia deaths in your family to know something was terribly wrong. You'd lost your son Leopold. You'd lost grandsons. You knew your daughters Alice and Beatrice had passed something to their children, though the genetic mechanism wasn't understood. According to your personal papers held at the Royal Archives, you expressed guilt and confusion about the family curse in your later years. Did you understand that you were the source? Probably not fully. Genetics was still emerging as a science, but you knew enough to feel guilt, to wonder what you had passed on, to watch your bloodline spreading this disease across Europe and feel responsible. Now let's examine the medical reality of hemophilia in more detail, because understanding the science makes the human tragedy more profound. Hemophilia is caused by mutations in genes that code for clotting factors. Hemophilia A, the most common type, is caused by mutations in the F8 gene, which codes for factor VIII. Hemophilia B, which your family had, is caused by mutations in the F9 gene, coding for factor IX. When you cut yourself, your body initiates a complex clotting cascade involving over a dozen different proteins working in sequence. Think of it like a chain reaction where each step activates the next. If even one factor is missing or defective, the entire cascade stalls and your blood can't clot properly. According to Dr. Harold Roberts at the University of North Carolina, even a 1% reduction in clotting factor can cause mild haemophilia. Your descendants had severe haemophilia, meaning less than 1% of normal factor IX levels. The symptoms of severe haemophilia are brutal. Spontaneous bleeding into joints hemarthrosis causes excruciating pain and progressive joint damage. Imagine your knee filling with blood, the joint capsule stretching, cartilage being destroyed by the iron in the blood. This happens repeatedly in multiple joints throughout childhood and adulthood. By adulthood, many haemophiliacs in the pre-treatment era were crippled by arthritis, unable to walk without crutches. Muscle bleeds create massive bruises called hematomas. These can compress nerves, causing permanent nerve damage. They can cut off blood supply to tissues, causing muscle death. They're intensely painful and can take weeks or months to fully resolve. The most dangerous bleeds are intracranial hemorrhages, bleeding in the brain. A minor head bump that would be nothing to a healthy person can cause a slow bleed inside the skull of a haemophiliac. The pressure builds gradually, causing headache, confusion, then unconsciousness and death. This is what killed Leopold, and what killed Alexei's ancestors and descendants. In Victoria's era, there was no treatment. Doctors could apply pressure to external wounds, but internal bleeding was beyond their help. They tried transfusions, but without blood typing or understanding of haemophilia, transfusions often did more harm than good. They tried various tonics and medicines, all useless. Mostly, they just watched children bleed and hoped the bleeding would stop spontaneously, which sometimes it did, and sometimes it didn't. The psychological toll on mothers was devastating. Imagine being Alexandra or Enna watching your son suffer through bleeding episodes, knowing each one could kill him, knowing you gave him this disease. The guilt was crushing. Both women became deeply depressed, obsessive about protecting their sons, willing to try any cure or treatment, no matter how dubious. According to psychiatric analysis by Dr. Martin Kalb at the Institute for the History of Medicine, carrier mothers in royal families often developed what we'd now recognize as anxiety disorders and PTSD. They were hypervigilant, constantly watching their sons for any sign of injury. They had nightmares about their children dying. They blamed themselves relentlessly, and they had to maintain public composure, smile at state functions, perform queenly duties, all while carrying this private terror. The fathers suffered too, but differently. Men like Alfonso of Spain felt their bloodline had been contaminated. They blamed their wives, even though the genetic reality was that the mutation came from the mother's side, but neither parent could have known or prevented it. The marriages became battlegrounds of blame and resentment. Now let's talk about the broader pattern of how this mutation spread through European royalty, because the full scope is staggering. You, Victoria, had 42 grandchildren. Of those, at least 3 were haemophiliacs and 5 were proven carriers. Those carriers married and had children, spreading the mutation further. Your great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren carried the mutation to Russia, Spain, Germany, Romania. Let me give you a partial family tree of the curse. Your son Leopold had one daughter, Alice, who was a carrier. Alice had one son, Rupert, who had haemophilia and died at age 21 in 1928 from a brain hemorrhage after a car accident. Your daughter Alice had 7 children, 2 of whom were carriers, Irene and Alexandra, who married into Russia. Irene married Prince Henry of Prussia and had 2 haemophiliac sons, Waldemar and Henry. Henry died at age 4 from a bleeding episode after a fall. Waldemar survived to adulthood, but was always in fragile health. Your daughter Beatrice had 4 children. Her daughter Victoria Eugenie, Enna married into Spain and had 2 haemophiliac sons, as we discussed. Her son Leopold died of haemophilia at age 33 during a hip surgery. He bled out on the operating table. Her son Maurice died at age 23 in World War I. possibly from bleeding complications exacerbated by battle wounds. Tracing every branch is complex, but genetic research by Dr. William Shull has identified at least 10 confirmed haemophiliacs among Victoria's descendants and at least 7 confirmed carriers in just the first 3 generations after Victoria. The mutations spread through intermarriage among European royalty, who are often cousins marrying cousins, concentrating the genetic defect. Now let's examine what it was like to be a carrier woman in these royal families, knowing you might pass this curse to your children, but having no choice but to marry and produce heirs. You are Princess Irene of Hesse, Alice's daughter, Victoria's granddaughter. You are a carrier, though you don't know it when you marry Prince Henry of Prussia in 1888. You have 3 sons. The first, Waldemar, is born in 1889 and seems healthy initially, but within months you notice the signs: bruising that is too extensive, bleeding that is too prolonged. Your stomach drops because you remember your brother Friedrich bleeding to death when you were a child. You remember the family whispers about the bleeding disease. You realize with horror that your son has it, and that means you are a carrier like your mother was. You are pregnant with your second son, Sigismund. When you realize Waldemar has haemophilia, you spend the pregnancy in terror, praying your next child will be spared. Sigismund is born in 1896 and dies at 4 months old from illness. Not haemophilia, just ordinary infant mortality. But you wonder if the family's weakened blood made him more vulnerable. Your third son, Henry, is born in 1900. Within a year, you know he has haemophilia too. 2 sons with this terrible disease. 2 sons you'll watch suffer. 2 sons who might die young. The guilt is overwhelming. You gave them this. You contaminated your husband's bloodline. His family blames you, though they're too polite to say it directly. Henry dies at age 4 in 1904. He fell from a chair, bumped his head, and developed a brain hemorrhage. You held him as he drifted into unconsciousness and died. Waldemar survives to adulthood, but barely. He lives a restricted, painful life, always aware that any injury could kill him. In 1945, at age 56, he has a minor car accident and dies from internal bleeding. You, Irene, live until 1953, age 87. You outlive both your haemophiliac sons. You spend decades carrying the knowledge that you gave them their disease, that your blood killed them. The psychological weight of that guilt shapes your entire life. Let's talk about the specific moment when carrier mothers learned their sons had haemophilia, because that moment of realization was traumatic and defining. You are N.A., Queen of Spain, and your first son Alfonso is a few months old. You notice blood on his diaper that won't stop. Your heart races because you remember the family stories about haemophilia, about Queen Victoria's curse. You call the doctor, trying to keep your voice calm, trying not to panic. The doctor examines the baby, does tests, asks about family history. When you mention that your grandmother was Queen Victoria, that there is haemophilia in the family tree, his face changes. He looks at you with pity and concern. He confirms what you already fear: your son has haemophilia. In that moment, your world collapses. You realize you are a carrier, which means your mother Beatrice was a carrier, which means any of your other children could have this too. You realize your marriage, already strained, will be destroyed by this. You realize your son might not live to adulthood, and if he does, he'll suffer constantly. You realize this is your fault, your blood, your genetic heritage, condemning your child. According to Iné's private letters, analysed by historian Dr. Gerard Noel, she had a nervous breakdown after Alfonso's diagnosis. She became withdrawn, depressed, obsessive about the baby's care. She blamed herself utterly and completely. King Alfonso's coldness toward her intensified her guilt and isolation. She was trapped in a marriage that had become a prison, trapped in a role that required her to produce healthy heirs when her very genes prevented it. Now let's examine how the haemophilia secret was kept, because royal families went to extraordinary lengths to hide their children's condition from the public. In Russia, Alexei's haemophilia was a state secret. The public knew the Tsarevich was delicate, often ill, but they didn't know he had haemophilia. Alexandra feared that if Russia knew their heir had this disease, it would undermine confidence in the monarchy. A sick heir, an heir who might die young or never be strong enough to rule, was a dynasty's nightmare. Photographs of Alexei were carefully staged to hide his condition. When he couldn't walk because of joint bleeds, he was photographed sitting. When his legs were too damaged to support him, he was carried by his sailor attendant Nagorny, but photos were framed to make it look like affection rather than medical necessity. Public appearances were limited and carefully controlled. According to documents from the Russian State Archive analysed by Dr. Helen Rappaport, Nicholas and Alexandra went to extreme lengths to conceal Alexei's condition. Bulletins about his health were vague. Doctors who treated him were sworn to secrecy. Court officials who knew the truth were told the information was classified for state security reasons. But secrets have costs. The secrecy around Alexei's health created space for Rasputin's influence to grow unchecked. If the public had known why Alexandra was so desperate, why she relied on this mystic, they might have been more sympathetic. Instead, the secrecy bred rumours and conspiracy theories that were often worse than the truth. People whispered that Rasputin was Alexandra's lover, that he was a German spy, that he was hypnotizing the royal family. The truth, that he was simply the only person who seemed able to help a mother's dying child, was hidden behind walls of secrecy that ultimately harmed the monarchy more than the haemophilia itself would have. In Spain, Enna and Alfonso also kept their son's haemophilia as quiet as possible, but it was harder to hide. The Spanish court was less controlled than the Russian court. Enna's son's bleeding episodes became known among the aristocracy, and rumours spread. The contaminated English bloodline, some called it the curse of the Battenbergs. Atta was blamed for bringing bad blood to Spain. Let me take you through a detailed day in the life of raising a haemophiliac prince in the early 1900s, because the daily reality was exhausting and terrifying. You are Alexandra, and Alexei is 5 years old. You wake early, as you always do, and immediately check on him. Did he bleed overnight? Is there swelling in any joints? Does he seem pale, suggesting internal bleeding? This morning he seems well, which fills you with relief and dread in equal measure. Relief that he survived the night. Dread because you know wellness is temporary, that the next bleed could start at any moment. You supervise his breakfast personally, cutting his food into small pieces so he won't cut his mouth eating. You watch him chew carefully, knowing that a bitten tongue or cheek could bleed for hours. After breakfast, Alexei wants to play. Your instinct is to wrap him in cotton wool, to forbid all activity, to keep him absolutely safe. But you also know that he is a boy, that he needs to run and play and live. You compromise controlled play in a soft-floored room, with Nagorny watching his every move, ready to catch him if he stumbles. An hour into playing, Alexei trips and bumps his elbow. It is nothing, barely a knock, but you freeze. Alexei starts crying, from fear as much as pain, because he knows what bumps mean. You examine his elbow, your hands shaking. Is there swelling? It is hard to tell yet. You apply ice and elevate his arm, the best you can do. Now you wait. If this develops into a bleed, you'll know within hours as the joint swells and Alexei's pain increases. By afternoon, the elbow is definitely swelling. Alexei is crying steadily now, a high keening that breaks your heart. You give him what pain medication you have, laudanum, which makes him drowsy but does little for the deep aching pain of a joint bleed. You send for the doctor, who examines Alexei and confirms it is a hemarthrosis. There is nothing to do but wait and hope the bleeding stops spontaneously. You send a telegram to Rasputin. The little one is suffering. Please pray for him. Rasputin's telegram comes back hours later. God sees your tears. The bleeding will stop. Do not worry. You want to believe him. You need to believe him. You don't sleep that night. You sit by Alexei's bed, holding his hand, listening to him whimper in his sleep. By morning, the swelling hasn't increased. By the next afternoon, it is stabilizing. By the third day, it is gradually reducing. This bleed is resolving. This time, Alexei will be okay, but his elbow will never be quite the same. The cartilage is damaged. The joint is weaker. The next bleed will be easier to trigger and harder to heal. This is your life. Day after day of this vigilance, this terror, this helpless watching, and you know it is your fault, your blood, your genes that did this to your son. The guilt is a physical weight you carry constantly. Now let's examine what happened to the royal families themselves as a result of the haemophilia curse, because the genetic disease had genuine political consequences. In Russia, the fall of the Romanovs is overdetermined. There are many factors including World War I, economic problems, political incompetence, but Alexandra's obsession with Rasputin, driven by her desperate need to save Alexei, was definitely a contributing factor. According to historian Dr. Richard Pipes at Harvard University, Rasputin's influence over government appointments and policy during World War I was catastrophic. Alexandra, ruling in Nicholas's absence, relied on Rasputin's advice on whom to appoint as ministers. Rasputin recommended people based on personal loyalty and mystical visions rather than competence. The government became a revolving door of incompetent ministers, and Russia's war effort suffered. The aristocracy and military leadership knew Rasputin was the problem, but they couldn't remove him because Alexandra protected him. Their frustration led to Rasputin's assassination in December 1916, which further destabilized the monarchy. 2 months later, the February Revolution forced Nicholas to abdicate. 8 months after that, the entire family was murdered. Would the revolution have happened without Alexei's haemophilia? Almost certainly, yes, given Russia's other problems. But would it have happened exactly when and how it did? Maybe not. The haemophilia created a specific vulnerability, a desperate mother willing to empower a mystic, an isolated royal family losing touch with reality, a government undermined by irrational decision-making. These factors mattered. In Spain, the haemophilia issue contributed to the monarchy's growing unpopularity. Alfonso the Turton was distracted by his son's illness and his marital problems. Ina was isolated and ineffective as queen, unable to build popular support because she was blamed for contaminating Spanish royal blood. When Spain faced political and economic crises in the 1920s and early 1930s, the royal family lacked the credibility and public support to weather them. Spain became a republic in 1931, and Alfonso the First went into exile. He never returned to Spain, dying in Rome in 1941. His haemophiliac son Alfonso renounced his succession rights in 1933 to marry a commoner, removing himself from the line of succession. When he died in 1938 from bleeding after a car accident, the curse had claimed another victim. Now let's talk about what modern genetic science has revealed about Victoria's specific mutation, because DNA analysis of living descendants has given us remarkable insights. In 2009, Russian scientists announced they had identified remains of the Romanov family through DNA analysis. They also analysed Alexei's DNA specifically to identify his haemophilia mutation. According to research published by Dr. Evgeny Rogaev at the University of Massachusetts, Alexei had haemophilia B caused by a specific mutation in the F9 gene. Through comparison with living descendants of Queen Victoria, researchers confirmed that this was the same mutation Victoria carried. They've identified the exact genetic change, a single nucleotide substitution that disrupts the factor IX protein's function. This means we can trace the mutation through Victoria's descendants with certainty. We know who carried it, who had haemophilia, who was at risk. We can even test living members of Victoria's family tree to see if they carry the mutation, though most royal families decline such testing for privacy reasons. The mutation is no longer a threat to European royalty, because modern haemophilia treatment is highly effective. Factor IX can be manufactured through genetic engineering and infused into haemophilia patients. essentially replacing what their bodies can't make. A hemophiliac today can live a nearly normal life with regular factor infusions. The curse has been broken by medical science, but for the generations before effective treatment existed, the curse was very real. At least 10 of Victoria's male descendants died from haemophilia. Countless others lived painful, restricted lives. The carrier women lived with guilt and grief. The families were torn apart by blame and resentment. And at least 2 monarchies, Russia, absolutely Spain arguably, were destabilized partly by this genetic disease. Let me introduce you to one more victim of the curse, because his story encapsulates the tragedy. Prince Rupert of Teck, born 1907, was Victoria's great-great-grandson through Leopold's daughter. Rupert had severe haemophilia. His childhood was restricted and painful. He couldn't attend regular school because any injury could be fatal. He was tutored privately, kept away from other children, wrapped in protective isolation. Despite his haemophilia, Rupert tried to live as normally as possible. He was intelligent, artistic, desperate for some kind of normal life. In 1928, at age 20, he was driving near his family's estate when he had a minor car accident. The impact caused internal bleeding. By the time he reached hospital, he was in shock from blood loss. There was nothing doctors could do. He died within hours. Rupert's mother, Princess Alice, wrote in her diary, "My beautiful boy is gone. The curse has taken him as it took so many before him. I knew this would happen. From the moment I learned he had the disease, I knew I would lose him young. But knowing didn't make it easier. He was my son. He should have had a full life. Instead, he had 20 years of pain and restriction. And then he died from a minor accident that wouldn't have scratched a normal person. God forgive me for giving him this disease." That guilt, "God forgive me for giving him this disease," echoes through generations of carrier mothers. They gave life, but they also gave death, and they knew it, and they lived with that knowledge every day. Now let's examine the counterfactual. What if Victoria hadn't had the mutation? Or what if she'd had it but her daughters hadn't married into European royalty? How would history be different? If Alexei hadn't had haemophilia, Alexandra wouldn't have been desperate enough to embrace Rasputin. Without Rasputin's influence, the Russian government might have been more competently run during World War I. The aristocracy wouldn't have been as alienated from the imperial family. The revolution might still have happened, but perhaps not in 1917, or not with such violence toward the Romanovs. Alexei might have survived to adulthood, possibly becoming Tsar during a very different 20th century. If Anna's sons hadn't had haemophilia, her marriage to Alfonso the Turk might have been happier, and she might have been a more effective queen. The Spanish monarchy might have maintained more public support during the political crises of the 1930s. Spain might not have become a republic or might have transitioned differently. The Spanish Civil War might not have happened or might have happened differently. Franco's dictatorship might never have existed. These are big ifs and probably overstate the haemophilia's historical importance. But it is undeniable that this genetic mutation affected European history in measurable ways. It weakened monarchies at a time when they were already under pressure. It created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. It distracted royal families from governance and made them seem weak or cursed to their subjects. Let's talk about the moral and ethical dimensions of arranged royal marriages in the context of genetic disease, because this raises difficult questions. By the time Anna married Alfonso in 1906, haemophilia in Victoria's family was known. Anna's mother Beatrice knew she was a carrier. Anna herself might have been a carrier. Should Beatrice have told Alfonso's family before the marriage? According to marriage negotiations documented in Spanish archives, Beatrice said nothing. She allowed her daughter to marry into Spanish royalty, knowing there was at least a 50% chance Anna was a carrier and would pass haemophilia to any sons. Some historians argue this was pragmatic. Royal marriages were political alliances and genetic concerns were secondary. Others argue it was grossly irresponsible, condemning another royal family to the curse. From Aya's perspective, she probably didn't know she was a carrier until her son was diagnosed. Women who are carriers have no symptoms, so without genetic testing, which didn't exist, Aina had no way to know, but she knew haemophilia ran in her family. She knew the risk. When she married Alfonso, she was taking a genetic gamble with her future children's lives. Was this unethical? By modern standards, yes. If you know you might carry a severe genetic disease, you have an ethical obligation to inform potential partners and to use genetic counselling before having children. But in 1906, genetics as a science barely existed. The term gene had only been coined a few years earlier. The mechanism of heredity was poorly understood. Expecting Em or her family to make modern genetic choices with 1906 knowledge isn't entirely fair, but they did know something was wrong. They knew haemophilia ran in families. They knew it passed from mothers to sons, even though mothers showed no symptoms. They could have chosen to tell Alfonso's family and let them make an informed decision. They chose not to, and that choice had consequences. Now let's examine what life was like for the haemophiliac boys themselves. From their own perspective, you are Prince Alexei, age 10, in 1914. You are aware, in the way children are aware, that you are different. You know you can't play like other boys. You know that bumps and falls, but wouldn't matter to your sisters because you terrible pain. You know your mother watches you constantly with fear in her eyes. You also know you are special. You are the Tveshevich, the heir to the largest empire on earth. Millions of people pray for your health. Your parents give you anything you want to make up for your suffering. You have the best toys, the finest clothes, attendants who cater to your every need. Your life is luxurious and pampered in every way, except the one that matters most. You are in pain constantly, and you are afraid. You've learned to hide your pain because showing it upsets your mother. You've learned to be stoic during bleeding episodes to endure the agony without screaming too much. You are brave because everyone expects you to be brave, because you are a prince, and princes don't cry. But inside, you are a terrified child who knows that any day could bring bleeding that won't stop. That will kill you. You love your mother desperately, and you hate that you cause her such distress. You wish you could be normal for her sake. You wish you could run and play and make her smile instead of making her worry. The guilt you feel for being sick, for being the source of her pain, is crushing, even though you are just a child, and none of this is your fault. According to Alexei's letters and diary entries preserved in archives and published by historian Dr. Greg King, Alexei was acutely aware of his mother's suffering. He wrote, "Mama cries when she thinks I don't see. I hate that I make her sad. I wish I wasn't sick. I wish I was brave like father or strong like my sisters. Instead, I am weak, and I hurt, and I make everyone worry." That psychological burden, a sick child feeling guilty for their illness, taking responsibility for their mother's distress, adds another layer of tragedy to the haemophilia curse. Let's talk about the specific medical breakthroughs that eventually broke the curse, because understanding how haemophilia became treatable makes you appreciate how helpless earlier generations were. The first major breakthrough came in the 1960s with the development of cryoprecipitate, a concentrated form of clotting factors that could be extracted from donated blood plasma. According to Dr. Judith Poole at Stanford University, who developed cryoprecipitate in 1964, this treatment revolutionized haemophilia care. For the first time, haemophiliacs could receive concentrated factor V8, or factor I kits, to stop bleeding episodes. They could undergo surgery with clotting factor support. They could treat bleeds at home before they became severe. Life expectancy for haemophiliacs increased dramatically. The 1970s and 1980s brought factor concentrates that were easier to use and more effective. Haemophiliacs could self-infuse at the first sign of bleeding, preventing the worst damage. But this era also brought tragedy. the blood supply became contaminated with HIV and hepatitis C, and thousands of haemophiliacs were infected and died. The contaminated blood scandal of the 1980s was a whole new nightmare for haemophilia families. The 1990s and 2000s brought recombinant factor products, synthetic clotting factors produced through genetic engineering rather than extracted from human blood. These eliminated the risk of blood-borne infections and provided a safer, more reliable treatment. Modern haemophiliacs using recombinant factors can live essentially normal lives. Gene therapy is now on the horizon. In 2022, the FDA approved Hemgenix, a gene therapy for hemophilia B that can potentially cure the disease with a single treatment. The therapy delivers a functional copy of the F9 gene to the patient's cells, allowing their body to produce its own factor IX. Early results show patients maintaining normal or near normal factor levels for years after treatment, essentially curing their hemophilia. If Victoria's descendants had access to modern treatment, none of them would have died. Leopold could have lived a full life. Alexei would have survived to adulthood, possibly preventing the Russian Revolution's trajectory. The Spanish princes would have grown old. The curse would have been a manageable medical condition rather than a death sentence. But they didn't have modern treatment. They had prayer and hope and watching helplessly as their children bled. And that difference between their reality and our reality is a measure of how far medicine has come and how much suffering existed before we had the knowledge to prevent it. Now, let's examine the specific women who were proven carriers and what happened to them, creating a comprehensive map of how the curse spread. Victoria had 9 children. 3 daughters were carriers: Alice, Helena, though Helena's carrier status is disputed, and Beatrice. Through them, the mutation spread to dozens of descendants. Alice, Grand Duchess of Hesse, had 7 children. 2 were carriers, Irene and Alexandra. Irene married into Prussia and had 2 haemophiliac sons. Alexandra married into Russia and had Alexei. Alice also had a haemophiliac son, Friedrich, who died at age 3. Through Alice's line, the mutation reached Russia, Prussia, and multiple German princely houses. Beatrice, Princess Henry of Battenberg, had 4 children. Her daughter Victoria Eugenie, Enna married into Spain and had 2 haemophiliac sons. Her son Leopold had haemophilia and died at age 33 from bleeding during surgery. Her son Maurice died at age 23, possibly from bleeding complications. Through Beatrice's line, the mutation reached Spain and several minor European royal houses. Helena, Princess Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, might have been a carrier, though this is debated. Some genealogists argue that her grandson suffered from haemophilia, suggesting she carried the mutation. Others argue the evidence is inconclusive. The uncertainty itself speaks to how difficult it was to trace genetic inheritance. Before modern DNA testing, Leopold, Duke of Albany, Victoria's haemophiliac son, had 1 daughter, Alice, who was definitely a carrier. Alice married Prince Alexander of Teck and had 1 son, Rupert, who had haemophilia and died at age 20. Through Leopold's line, the mutation affected the Teck family and was carried into minor British nobility. Tracing every branch becomes complex, but genetic researchers have documented at least 10 confirmed haemophiliac descendants of Victoria and at least 7 confirmed female carriers in the first 3 generations. In subsequent generations, the numbers grow, though tracking becomes harder as royal families intermarried with commoners and genetic information became private. The last confirmed haemophiliac in Victoria's line was probably Prince Waldemar of Prussia, Irene's son, who died in 1945. By then, some carrier women had chosen not to have children to avoid passing on the mutation. Others had children who, by genetic chance, didn't inherit the mutation. And as treatment became available, haemophilia stopped being a death sentence. Let me tell you about one final carrier woman, Princess Alice of Athlone, because her story shows how carrier women coped in the modern era. Alice was Leopold's daughter, born 1883, definitely a carrier. She married Alexander of Teck in 1904. Their first child, a daughter named May, was born in 1906 and died at age 3 from illness. Not haemophilia, just ordinary tragedy. Their son Rupert was born in 1907. Alice knew immediately that she was a carrier and that Rupert had a 50% chance of haemophilia. She watched him obsessively for signs. By age 1, it was clear Rupert had the disease. Alice spent the next 20 years watching her son suffer, protecting him, living with guilt. When Rupert died in 1928, Alice was devastated, but also by her own admission, relieved that his suffering was over. She lived until 1981, dying at age 97. She outlived her haemophiliac son by over 50 years. In her later years, she gave interviews about her experiences, helping researchers understand the family's medical history. She was one of the last direct connections to Victoria, who could speak about the curse from personal experience. Alice said in a 1975 interview, "I knew from the moment I learned I was a carrier that I might pass this to my children. I almost didn't marry because of it, but I loved Alexander and I wanted a normal life. When Rupert was diagnosed, the guilt was overwhelming. I felt I had no right to have brought him into the world to suffer. But he was also my beloved son, and I treasured every moment with him, painful as they were. Would I make the same choice again, knowing what I know now? I honestly don't know." That ambivalence, the conflict between wanting children and knowing you might condemn them to suffering, haunted carrier women throughout the curse's history. They were caught between biology and desire, between duty and fear, between hope and guilt. Now let's examine the political and social implications of a genetic disease in royal families, because haemophilia exposed the fundamental problem with hereditary monarchy. Monarchies are based on bloodline, the idea that fitness to rule passes from parent to child through genetic inheritance. But haemophilia proved that genetic inheritance could pass weakness and disease just as easily as it passed ruling legitimacy. If the heir to the throne has haemophilia, is he fit to rule? In theory, haemophilia affects only blood clotting, not intelligence or leadership ability. Alexei might have been a perfectly capable Tsar if he'd lived to adulthood, haemophilia notwithstanding, but in practice, a haemophiliac ruler was seen as weak, as contaminated, as a sign that the dynasty itself was failing. According to political historian Dr. David Carradine at Princeton University, haemophilia in royal families contributed to growing public skepticism about monarchy in the early 20th century. If royal blood was supposed to be superior, why was it diseased? If God chose monarchs to rule, why did he allow their heirs to inherit terrible genetic conditions? The curse undermined the mystical foundation of monarchy itself. Some European countries responded by changing succession laws to allow succession through the female line or to more distant male relatives if the direct heir was unfit. Others began questioning whether hereditary monarchy made sense at all. The haemophilia crisis coincided with and contributed to the broader crisis of monarchy in the 20th century. Republics don't have this problem. If a president or prime minister has a genetic disease, it doesn't matter for succession, because succession isn't based on bloodline. Democracies can select leaders based on competence rather than genetics. The curse made this advantage of democratic systems very visible. Let's talk about the emotional reality of watching a child die from haemophilia, because the medical details don't fully capture the human tragedy. You are a Mother Alexandra, Anna, Irene, any of the carrier women, and your son is bleeding to death. Maybe it is from trauma, a car accident, or a fall. Maybe it is a spontaneous bleed with no apparent cause. Either way, he is dying, and you are watching, and there is nothing you can do. The bleeding might be internal, in his abdomen or his brain. You can see him deteriorating, pale, clammy skin, rapid pulse, confusion, loss of consciousness, but you can't see the bleeding itself, can't put pressure on it, can't stop it. You just watch your child slip away. Or maybe the bleeding is external from a wound or a nosebleed. Blood keeps coming, soaking through towels and bandages, pooling on the floor. You apply pressure until your hands ache, but it doesn't stop. You watch the colour drain from your child's face as he loses blood. You see fear in his eyes as he realises he might be dying. You try to stay calm, to comfort him, but inside you are screaming. According to accounts from carrier mothers compiled by Dr. Stephen Pemberton at Boston University, the trauma of watching a child die from haemophilia was profound and lasting. Women described nightmares that persisted for decades. They described intrusive thoughts of their child's suffering. They described crushing guilt that they could never escape. Some women became deeply religious, seeing their child's death as God's will and finding some comfort in faith. Others lost faith entirely, unable to believe in a God who would allow such suffering. Some became advocates for medical research, hoping to prevent other families from experiencing what they had. Others withdrew completely, unable to bear talking about their loss. The husbands grieved too, but often differently. Men in this era weren't encouraged to express emotion openly. They were expected to be stoic, to move on, to focus on duty. This created distance in marriages where grief wasn't shared. The mothers felt abandoned in their grief. The fathers felt helpless and frustrated. The marriages often didn't survive. As we come toward the end of tonight's journey, let's reflect on what the curse of haemophilia in European royalty teaches us about genetics, heredity, and the randomness of genetic disease. Victoria's mutation was probably spontaneous, a copying error during DNA replication, a cosmic ray striking a chromosome at just the wrong moment, pure bad luck. From that single molecular accident, a cascade of suffering spread across a century and a continent. Modern genetics tells us that this kind of random mutation happens all the time. Each of us carries dozens of new mutations that our parents didn't have. Most mutations are neutral or even beneficial, but some, like Victoria's F9 mutation, are catastrophic. And once they exist, they can spread through reproduction, affecting generation after generation, until either the mutation is lost through chance or medical science develops a treatment. The haemophilia curse wasn't divine punishment or supernatural evil. It was just biology, genetic information being copied and passed on, utterly indifferent to human suffering. Victoria wasn't cursed by God. She was cursed by probability, by the random molecular accident that inserted an error into her DNA. But the suffering was real. The children who died in pain, the mothers who lived with guilt, the families torn apart, the political consequences, all real, all flowing from that one molecular accident. The randomness doesn't make it less tragic. If anything, it makes it more tragic, because there is no meaning, no purpose, no lesson to learn except that biology doesn't care about us and genetic disease can strike anyone. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, think about the women who carried this curse. Victoria, who unknowingly passed it to her children and watched it spread through her descendants. Alice, who saw her brother and her son die from it. Alexandra, who watched Alexei suffer and blamed herself. Anna, whose marriage was destroyed by it. Irene, who lost 2 sons to it. All of them trapped in roles they couldn't escape, carrying genes they didn't choose, watching children suffer from diseases they had given them. Think about the children too. Leopold, Friedrich, Alexei, Rupert, Waldemar, Henry, Alfonso, Gonzalo, Maurice, all the haemophiliac boys who lived restricted, painful lives and died young. They didn't choose their genes either. They were innocent victims of molecular randomness, born into luxury and privilege that couldn't save them from a disease in their DNA. And think about what the curse teaches us about biology, heredity, and human vulnerability. We're all carrying genes, some good, some neutral, some potentially harmful. We're all vulnerable to random mutations, genetic accidents, inherited diseases. The royals weren't special or different. They were just human, just as genetically fragile as everyone else, despite all their wealth and power. The curse is broken now. Modern medicine has turned haemophilia from a death sentence into a manageable condition. The descendants of Victoria who still carry the mutation can live normal lives. The genetic disease that destroyed empires is now treated with regular infusions of manufactured clotting factors. But the memory remains. The suffering was real. The tragedy was real. And remembering it helps us appreciate how far medicine has come and how much suffering existed before we had the knowledge to prevent it. But before we close tonight's journey, let's dive deeper into specific moments that illuminate the human cost of this genetic tragedy, because the individual experiences make the historical scope more real and more heartbreaking. Let me take you inside the Spa crisis of 1912 in minute detail, because those 11 days when Alexei nearly died reveal everything about what haemophilia meant for royal families. You are Alexandra, and you are in the family's hunting lodge in Poland. It is late September, beautiful autumn weather. Alexei, age 8, is excited to be at Spasia. He loves being outdoors, loves the freedom of the countryside after the constraints of palace life. On the 2nd of September, Alexei is getting into a rowboat to go out on the lake with his sisters. He is moving quickly, excited, and he bumps his upper left thigh on the side of the boat. It is a minor bump, he says. Ow, rubs his leg and keeps going. You notice but don't think much of it. Bumps happen. Sometimes they develop into bleeds. Sometimes they don't. You've learned not to panic at every minor injury, or you'd be in constant panic. That evening, Alexei complains that his leg hurts. You examine it and see some bruising, but not excessive. You tell him to rest. Apply a cold compress. Hope for the best. The next morning, the bruise is larger, and Alexei is limping. This is concerning, but not yet crisis level. You restrict his activity and watch carefully. By the 4th of September, Alexei can't walk. The bruise has spread across his entire thigh, a massive purple-black stain under his skin. More concerning, his thigh is swelling. You can see it is larger than his other thigh, taut and painful to touch. Alexei is crying constantly from the pain. You call the doctors. Dr. Evgeny Botkin examines Alexei and immediately understands this is serious. The bump to his thigh caused bleeding deep in his quadriceps muscle. The blood is accumulating, forming a massive hematoma. But worse, the growing hematoma is putting pressure on his femoral artery, the major blood vessel supplying his leg. If the pressure completely cuts off blood flow, his leg tissue will die. Gangrene will set in. They'll have to amputate, and amputation on a haemophiliac is almost certain death from bleeding during surgery. You spend the 5th of September through 15th in a nightmare that blurs together. Alexei's pain is beyond anything you've witnessed before. He screams for hours, begging you to help him, begging God to let him die. The pain medication barely touches the agony of his swollen leg. He develops a fever from inflammation and possibly infection. His leg is grotesquely swollen, twice the size of his other leg, the skin stretched so tight it looks ready to burst. You don't sleep. You sit by his bed day and night, holding his hand, wiping his forehead, praying constantly. Nicholas is there too when his schedule permits, but he has to maintain some government functions even in crisis. The girls, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, are kept away because the sight of their brother's suffering is too disturbing. Dr. Botkin and the other physicians try everything they know. They apply ice to reduce swelling. They elevate the leg, they give morphine for pain, though it makes Alexei drowsy and confused. They consider surgery to relieve the pressure, but everyone knows that cutting into a haemophiliac is extremely dangerous. They decide to wait and hope the bleeding stops spontaneously. By the 10th of September, Alexei is delirious with pain and fever. He drifts in and out of consciousness. When he is conscious, he begs to die. He says, "Mama, help me, make it stop. I can't bear it anymore. Please let me die." Your heart shatters every time. You want to help, but you can't. There is nothing you can do but watch your child suffer. The Russian court issues bulletins preparing the nation for the Tarevich's death. A priest comes to give Alexei last rites. Nicholas breaks down crying. something you've never seen before. The doctors privately tell you that Alexei will likely die within days, either from the bleeding itself or from gangrene if his leg tissue dies. On the 11th of September, in desperation, you send a telegram to Rasputin, who is in Siberia. The telegram says simply, "Alexei is dying. Please pray for him." You are grasping at straws, appealing to anyone who might help when medicine has failed. Rasputin's reply comes the next day. "God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve. The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much. This is bizarre advice. Leave the dying child alone. But you are desperate enough to try anything. You tell the doctors to stop their interventions. No more examinations. No more moving Alexei to check the swelling. No more trying different treatments. Just pain medication and letting him rest quietly. This goes against all medical instinct, but you do it because Rasputin said to, and impossibly Alexei begins to improve. The swelling stabilizes on the 13th of September. On the 14th, it starts to slowly reduce. Alexei's fever breaks. The pain eases slightly. By the 20th of September, he is clearly out of danger, though still very weak. By October, he can walk with crutches. By December, he is mostly recovered, though his leg will never be quite the same. What happened? Modern medical analysis suggests that the doctor's interventions were actually making things worse. Every time they examined Alexei's leg, they risked restarting the bleeding. Every movement could disrupt the clot that was slowly forming. By leaving him completely still and quiet, Rasputin's advice gave the natural clotting process time to work. But you don't see it that way. You see a miracle. Your son was dying. The doctors had given up, and Rasputin's prayer saved him. This experience cements your absolute faith in Rasputin. From this moment forward, you believe he has divine power over Alexei's life. You will trust him completely, rely on him desperately, give him influence over your family and your government. The political consequences of this faith will be catastrophic, but right now, you don't care. Your son is alive, and Rasputin saved him. Now let's examine what life was like for Alexei between bleeding crises, because his daily existence, even when healthy, was shaped entirely by his disease. You are Alexei, age 10, and you are having a good day. No active bleeding, no severe pain, just the background aches you've learned to live with. What does your day look like? You wake up in your rooms in the Alexander Palace. Your attendant, the sailor Nagorny, is already there. Nagorny has been assigned to you specifically to keep you safe. He is a large, strong man who can carry you when you can't walk and catch you if you fall. He is also gentle and kind, more like a friend than a guard. But his primary job is to prevent injuries. Your mother comes to check on you first thing every morning. She examines you for any signs of bleeding, bruises, swelling, complaints of pain. This morning you are okay, and you can see her visible relief. She kisses your forehead and goes to breakfast. You eat breakfast in your rooms, not in the formal dining room, because eating with your family would require you to maintain formal posture for too long, which could cause muscle strain and potentially bleeding. After breakfast, your tutor comes for lessons. You are intelligent and you enjoy learning, but concentration is hard when you are in chronic pain. Your joints ache from previous bleeds. Your leg, which was so badly damaged at Sparia, still hurts when weather changes. You shift position frequently trying to get comfortable, and your tutor understands and doesn't scold you. At mid-morning you are allowed some physical activity, but it is carefully controlled. You might walk in the garden with Nagorny beside you, ready to catch you if you stumble. You might play a careful, gentle game with your sisters, who've been taught to be extremely cautious around you. You desperately want to run, to climb, to do rough physical play like other boys, but you can't. Every instinct to move freely must be suppressed, because movement means risk. Lunch is quiet. You tire easily because hemophilia causes chronic anemia. You are always slightly low on blood from minor chronic bleeding. After lunch, you rest. Resting is a large part of your life. You read, or Nagorny reads to you, or you play with your dog. You've learned to find contentment in quiet activities because active ones are forbidden. Afternoon might bring a medical examination. Dr. Botkin checks you regularly, looking for any signs of internal bleeding, joint damage, or other complications. You've become stoic about medical examinations. You've learned to disconnect emotionally while doctors prod your joints, take blood samples, ask endless questions about your pain levels. Evening is family time if you are well enough. Your parents and sisters gather, and there is music or reading or conversation. These are the moments you treasure, feeling normal, feeling like part of the family rather than the sick child who requires constant vigilance. But even these moments are shadowed by your awareness that any small accident could end them. A tumble from a chair, a bump against a table corner, any minor mishap could trigger the next crisis. At bedtime you pray. You pray that you won't have bleeding in the night. You pray that tomorrow will be a good day. You pray that someday you'll be healed. You are a child of deep faith, partly because you've been taught to be, and partly because faith gives you hope when medicine offers none. This is your life on a good day. But good days are constantly under threat from the next bleeding episode, which could start at any moment for any reason or no reason at all. Now let's examine the specific political consequences of Alexandra's faith in Rasputin in granular detail, because this is where the curse directly intersects with the fall of the Russian Empire. You are a Russian aristocrat, Count Vladimir Kokov, and it is 1913. You are concerned about the growing influence of this peasant, mystic Rasputin over the Empress. You've heard the rumors about Rasputin, that he is crude, drinks heavily, has inappropriate relationships with society women who fall under his spell. You've heard he is influencing government appointments, that Alexandra consults him on policy matters. You know this is dangerous for the monarchy's reputation, but you also understand why Alexandra relies on Rasputin. You are one of the few people who knows the truth about Alexei's haemophilia. It is a closely guarded state secret. You understand that Alexandra's faith in Rasputin comes from desperation to save her son. You even have some sympathy for her impossible situation. Nevertheless, as a government minister, you can see the damage Rasputin is doing. When World War I begins in 1914 and Nicholas goes to military headquarters to command troops, Alexandra is left as regent. She consults Rasputin on whom to appoint as ministers. Rasputin recommends people based on personal loyalty and mystical visions, rather than competence. According to Russian State Archive documents analysed by historian Dr. Dominik Lieven between 1915 and 1917, Russia had 4 different prime ministers, 6 different interior ministers, 3 different foreign ministers, and 4 different war ministers. This revolving door of incompetent or corrupt officials, many appointed on Rasputin's recommendation, created chaos in government, exactly when Russia needed stability to manage the war effort. You, as Kokovtsov, try to warn Alexandra that Rasputin's influence is destroying the government and damaging the monarchy's reputation. Alexandra responds coldly that you don't understand. That Rasputin is a man of God who has saved Alexei's life repeatedly, that she trusts him completely. Your warnings are dismissed. The aristocracy becomes increasingly frustrated and alarmed. In December 1916, a group of nobles, including Prince Felix Yusupov, decide to assassinate Rasputin. They lure him to Yusupov's palace, poison him with cyanide-laced cakes and wine, shoot him multiple times, beat him, and finally drown him in the Neva River. Rasputin's murder is brutal and desperate, a sign of how threatened the nobility felt. But killing Rasputin doesn't solve the underlying problems. Alexandra is devastated by his death and becomes even more isolated and paranoid. The government remains chaotic. The war continues to go badly, and just 2 months after Rasputin's death, in February 1917, revolution erupts. Nicholas is forced to abdicate in March. By October, the Bolsheviks have taken power. In July 1918, the entire royal family is executed. Could the revolution have been prevented if Alexei hadn't had haemophilia? If Alexandra hadn't been desperate enough to rely on Rasputin? If the government hadn't been undermined by Rasputin-influenced appointments? These are unanswerable counterfactuals, but historians agree that the haemophilia crisis was a significant contributing factor to the monarchy's fall, according to Dr. Richard Pipes's comprehensive analysis in the Russian Revolution. Alexei's haemophilia created multiple vulnerabilities: Alexandra's isolation and irrationality in trying to protect her son, Rasputin's malign influence, the secrecy that bred conspiracy theories, the distraction from governance as the royal couple focused on their sick child. None of these alone would have caused the revolution, but together they weakened an already fragile system at precisely the moment it could least afford weakness. Let's examine what happened to the royal children after their father's abdication, because the haemophilia curse followed them even into captivity and death. The family is arrested in March 1917 and held under house arrest at the Alexander Palace. Then, in August 1917, they're moved to Tobolsk in Siberia, a small town where they're kept in the former governor's mansion. Life in Tobolsk is restricted, but not yet brutal. The family has some comfort, some freedom of movement within their guarded compound. Alexei is now 13 and dealing with haemophilia in adolescence, which brings new challenges. Puberty can increase bleeding tendency. Growth spurts strengths that are already damaged from years of bleeds. He is dealing with a disease that is hard enough for a child and becoming harder as he matures. In April 1918, the Bolsheviks move the family again, this time to Ekaterinburg in the Urals. Conditions are much worse here. They're confined to a few rooms in the Ipatiev house, now called the House of Special Purpose, an ominous name that proves prophetic. They have minimal privacy, hostile guards, limited food and supplies. Alexei is having bleeding problems during this time, according to testimony from Dr. Evgeny Botkin, who was imprisoned with the family. Alexei had at least 2 significant bleeding episodes while in Ekaterinburg. Dr. Botkin had almost no medical supplies to treat him. No clotting factor concentrates, no pain medication beyond basic morphine, no diagnostic equipment. He could only provide comfort, care and hope. On the night of the 16th of July, -17, 1918, the family is woken and told they're being moved again. They're taken to the basement. Alexei is weak from a recent bleeding episode and can't walk, so Nicholas carries him. They're told to wait while transportation is arranged. Then the executioners enter. Yakov Yurovsky, the chief executioner, reads a brief statement saying the Ural Soviet has decided to execute them. Before the family can fully react, shooting begins. Nicholas is killed first, shot multiple times. Alexandra doesn't even have time to fully cross herself before she is shot. Alexei is sitting in a chair because he is too weak to stand. He is shot multiple times but doesn't die immediately. The bullets have to penetrate his body, and he is small, and the shooting is chaotic. According to Yurovsky's own account, written years later, Alexei was still alive after the initial volley, and had to be shot again at close range to finish him. The irony is terrible. Alexei survived 13 years with a disease that could have killed him at any moment. He survived bleeds that should have been fatal. He survived the Sparta crisis when doctors thought he would die. He survived years of revolution and imprisonment. And in the end, he died not from his haemophilia but from bullets in a basement, because his family's political position had become untenable. Would things have been different if Alexei had been healthy? If Alexandra hadn't been driven to desperation by his illness? If Rasputin had never gained influence? Possibly, but we'll never know. What we know is that Alexei died at 13, that his short life was defined by suffering and restriction, and that the disease he inherited from his great-great-grandmother played a role in the chain of events that led to his murder. Now let's turn to the Spanish branch of the curse and examine what life was like for Ina as her marriage disintegrated. You are Ember, Queen of Spain, and it is 1910. Your son Alfonso, Prince of Asturias, is 3 years old and clearly has severe haemophilia. Your second son Jaime is 2 and appears healthy, but was born deaf, which Alfonso III blames on your bloodline, though deafness doesn't run in your family. You are pregnant with your 3rd child and terrified of what you might be carrying. Alfonso III has turned cold and distant. He barely speaks to you except when court protocol requires. He openly keeps mistresses and makes sure you know about them. When you attend state functions together, he is polite but remote. In private, he is cruel, blaming you for contaminating Spanish royal blood with English disease. Your son's haemophilia is known among the Spanish aristocracy, and they blame you too. At court, you overhear whispers, English curse, bad blood. Should never have married outside Spain. The isolation is crushing. You have no real friends, no confidants, no one who understands what you are going through. Your 3rd child is born in 1911, another son, Beatriz. Wait, no, actually a daughter, also named Beatriz. The relief when you learn the baby is a girl is overwhelming because girls can't have haemophilia, only carry it. But then the terror returns because your daughter has a 50% chance of being a carrier like you, condemned to potentially pass this curse to her own children. You spend your days managing young Alfonso's haemophilia as best you can. The Spanish court physicians are competent, but have no better treatments than Russian physicians had for Alexei. When Alfonso bleeds, all you can do is apply cold compresses, restrict his movement, and pray. The isolation means you don't have the support network Alexandra had. You are largely on your own. In 1914, your 4th child is born, another son, Fernando. Within months, he is haemophiliac too. 2 sons with this terrible disease. The curse has struck twice. Your husband's anger and blame intensify. Your isolation deepens. You are trapped in a loveless marriage in a country that blames you for their damaged royal bloodline. According to Inés's personal letters preserved in Spanish royal archives and analysed by historian Dr. Gerard Noel, she considered leaving Alfonso, fleeing Spain, escaping this nightmare. But where would she go? Divorce a Catholic king was nearly impossible. Abandoning her children was unthinkable. She was trapped by duty, by religion, by social convention, by her own guilt and sense of responsibility. Over the next years, you have 3 more children: Maria Cristina, 1911, Juan, 1913, and Gonzalo, 1914. Gonzalo also has haemophilia. 3 of your 6 sons have the disease. The odds said you should have approximately half of your sons affected, and you beat the odds in the worst possible way. You got 3 out of 4 sons, excluding Jaime, who was deaf but not haemophiliac. Living with this becomes your entire life. Managing 3 haemophiliac sons while dealing with a hostile husband and a court that despises you, watching your boys suffer, carrying crushing guilt, having no one to turn to for support or comfort. You develop what we'd now recognize as clinical depression, but in 1920s Spain, it is just seen as appropriate melancholy for a woman in your unfortunate position. The worst comes in the 1930s and 40s when your haemophiliac sons reach adulthood and start dying. Alfonso dies in 1938, at age 31 from internal bleeding after a minor car accident. Gonzalo dies in 1934, at age 19, also from bleeding after a car accident. 2 sons dead from your genetic curse. The grief and guilt threaten to destroy you. Spain has become a republic in 1931, and you are in exile. Your marriage to Alfonso has finally ended, not officially divorced, because that is impossible in Catholic Spain, but separated. You are living in Switzerland, alone except for your children, watching your haemophiliac sons die one by one. Enna lives until 1969, dying at age 81. She outlives both her haemophiliac sons by decades. In her later years, she gives interviews where she reflects on her life. She says, "I brought a curse to Spain. I didn't know I carried it, but that doesn't absolve me. My sons suffered because of my blood. My marriage was destroyed because of my blood. I would give anything to go back and make different choices, but I don't know what choices I could have made differently. That is the tragedy of genetic disease. There often aren't different choices available. Enna didn't choose to be a carrier. She didn't choose to pass haemophilia to her sons. She couldn't have known before marriage, or made different reproductive choices in an era before genetic testing. She was trapped by biology, as much as by social circumstances. Now let's examine what modern genetic analysis has revealed about the specific mutation, because DNA science has given us remarkable insights into Victoria's curse. In 2009, Russian scientists announced they had recovered and analyzed DNA from the Romanov remains found in Ekaterinburg. This gave them genetic material from Alexei and from his mother, Alexandra, both of whom carried the mutation. According to research by Dr. Evgeny Regev published in Science magazine, Alexei had hemophilia B caused by a single nucleotide substitution in the F9 gene on the X chromosome. Specifically, a thymine was substituted for a cytosine at position 27,993 of the gene, creating a premature stop codon that truncates the factor IX protein and makes it non-functional. This exact mutation has been found in other confirmed descendants of Queen Victoria, proving they all inherited the same mutation from the same source. Genetic comparison with living relatives of Victoria has traced the mutation through multiple generations, creating a molecular family tree of the curse. What is particularly interesting is that this specific mutation is quite rare. Most haemophilia B cases are caused by different mutations in the F9 gene. There are over 1,000 known mutations that can cause haemophilia B. Victoria's mutation is unusual, which helps confirm that all the royal haemophiliacs shared a common ancestor in Victoria. Modern genetic screening could identify this mutation in potential carriers. Any living descendant of Victoria who wants to know their carrier status could be tested. Most choose not to be tested because the information is private, and because modern haemophilia treatment is so effective that knowing carrier status is less urgent than it would have been historically. But the genetic analysis has confirmed what historians suspected. Victoria was almost certainly the source of the mutation. Her mother's family showed no signs of haemophilia, and her father, the Duke of Kent, though there is historical speculation about whether he was actually her biological father, had no haemophilia in his lineage. The mutation either arose in Victoria herself or in her mother, but it started in that generation. There is also fascinating speculation about whether the mutation might have affected British history if Victoria had had different children. She had 4 sons. Only one, Leopold, had haemophilia. If her eldest son Edward, who became Edward VII, had been haemophiliac instead of Leopold, he likely would have died young, changing the line of succession. If her third son Arthur had been haemophiliac, British military history might be different. Arthur was a career soldier who became a field marshal. Impossible career path for a haemophiliac. The genetic randomness of which children inherited the mutation shaped history. Each of Victoria's conceptions was a genetic coin flip. Would this child get the normal X or the mutated X? The pattern of heads and tails in those coin flips determined which royal houses would be affected, which children would suffer, which dynasties would be weakened. History turned on molecular chance. Let's examine what life was like for Leopold, Victoria's haemophiliac son, because his story deserves detailed attention. You are Leopold, born 1853, Victoria's 8th child. From infancy, you are different. You bruise easily. Minor bumps cause massive bruises. Cuts bleed longer than they should. By age 2, it is clear something is seriously wrong. Victorian medicine has no name for your condition and no treatment. Doctors recommend limiting your physical activity, avoiding injuries, applying cold compresses to bleeds. Beyond that, they can only watch and hope. You spend much of your childhood indoors, restricted from the rough play your brothers enjoy. You are intelligent and artistic, developing talents that don't require physical activity, because physical activity is dangerous for you. As you grow, you experience what every hemophiliac experiences: the cycle of bleeding, recovery, damage, and fear. You have joint bleeds that leave your knees and elbows permanently damaged. You have muscle bleeds that create massive bruises and chronic pain. You live with the knowledge that any injury could kill you, but you are also a prince with responsibilities and expectations. You attend Oxford University, studying art and literature. You are talented and ambitious, wanting to contribute meaningfully despite your physical limitations. In 1880, aged 27, you convince your mother to allow you to marry Princess Helena of Waldeck and Pyrmont. Victoria is reluctant because she fears you won't live long enough to see your children grow, but she eventually consents. You and Helena have 2 children. Your daughter Alice is born in 1883. The birth goes well, but you know that Alice has a 100% chance of being a carrier because she inherited your X chromosome with the mutation. You've condemned your daughter to potentially pass this disease to her children. The guilt is terrible, but you also desperately want children, want some normalcy in your abbreviated life. In March 1884, you are in Cannes, France, trying to recover from a recent bleeding episode. On the 27th of March, you slip on a staircase. It is a minor fall, barely worth mentioning for a healthy person, but you feel the impact to your head, and immediately you know, brain bleed. This is the end you've always feared. You are taken to your rooms. Headache develops rapidly, severe and crushing. You become confused, disoriented. Helena is with you, terrified, watching helplessly. Doctors are called, but there is nothing they can do. The bleeding in your brain continues, building pressure, crushing brain tissue. You slip into unconsciousness. You die on the 28th of March, 1884, age 30, from a brain hemorrhage triggered by a minor fall. Your daughter Alice is less than a year old. Your son is born posthumously 4 months later. Leopold also has haemophilia and will die at age 19 from bleeding during surgery. Your life was short, restricted, defined by disease. You didn't choose and couldn't control, but you tried to live as fully as your condition allowed, pursuing education and art and family despite constant danger. Your tragedy was being born in an era when haemophilia was untreatable, when even minor accidents could be fatal, when your disease isolated you from normal life. Now let's look at the broader genetic principles that make haemophilia inheritance so cruel, because understanding the math makes the tragedy more visceral. You are a carrier woman. Victoria, Alice, Irene, Beatrice, Enna, any of them. You have 2 X chromosomes, one normal, one carrying the haemophilia mutation. When you conceive a child, you randomly pass on one X chromosome. If you conceive a daughter, she receives one X from you and one X from your husband, who has normal clotting genes on his X. There is a 50% chance you pass on your mutated X, making your daughter a carrier like you. There is a 50% chance you pass on your normal X, making your daughter completely unaffected. Your daughters are safe from the disease itself, but they might become carriers who will face the same impossible choices you faced. If you conceive a son, he receives one X from you and a Y from your husband. If he gets your normal X, he is completely unaffected. If he gets your mutated X, he has haemophilia, because his Y chromosome has no clotting factor genes to compensate. It is a 50-50 coin flip whether your son will have this terrible disease. Every time you conceive, you are rolling genetic dice. Each pregnancy is a new independent event with the same 50% probabilities. Having one haemophiliac son doesn't make the next son less likely to be affected. Having 3 carrier daughters doesn't mean the 4th must be unaffected. Each child is an independent genetic lottery. This randomness is psychologically brutal. You can't control it, can't prevent it, can't even predict it before birth. You conceive in hope and wait in terror to see what genetic hand your child has been dealt. And if you have a haemophiliac son, you know you gave him that mutation, that your genetic contribution doomed him to suffering. Some carrier women in Victoria's family chose not to have children to avoid passing on the mutation. But this was rare because royal women were expected to produce heirs, and personal choice was subordinated to dynastic duty. Most carrier women had multiple children, despite knowing each son had a 50% chance of haemophilia, either because they had no choice or because they hoped they'd be lucky. Enna had 6 children, and 3 of 4 sons had haemophilia, worse than the 50% odds predicted. Irene had 3 sons, and 2 had haemophilia, also worse than odds predicted. Victoria herself had 4 sons, and 1 had haemophilia, better than odds predicted. The randomness meant some families were devastated, while others escaped relatively lightly. Let's examine the specific treatments that were attempted in the Victorian and Edwardian eras, because understanding how helpless medicine was makes the suffering more real. You are a physician treating a haemophiliac prince in 1890. A child is brought to you with a severe joint bleed. His knee is massively swollen, exquisitely painful, possibly at risk of permanent damage. What can you do? First, you apply cold compresses to the joint, hoping that cold will cause blood vessels to constrict and slow the bleeding. This helps marginally but doesn't stop significant bleeds. Second, you elevate the affected limb to reduce blood pressure in the area. Again, this helps marginally. Third, you give pain medication. Your options are limited: morphine or laudanum, opium tincture for severe pain, aspirin or willow bark for mild pain. But here is a cruel problem. Aspirin inhibits platelet function and makes bleeding worse. You might give aspirin not knowing you are making the problem worse. Even morphine has risks. It lowers blood pressure, which might reduce bleeding, but also could cause shock. Fourth, you restrict movement and enforce bed rest. Movement could restart bleeding, so the child must stay absolutely still until the bleed resolves. For a young, active boy, this is psychological torture on top of physical pain. Fifth, and this is where Victorian medicine gets really problematic, you might try various treatments that were popular but useless or harmful. Blood transfusions were attempted, but without knowledge of blood types, transfusions often cause deadly transfusion reactions. Injections of various substances, calcium, gelatin, snake venom, were tried based on theories about what might help clotting. None of them worked. Some physicians tried surgical intervention, draining large hematomas to relieve pressure, but surgery on a haemophiliac usually caused more bleeding. Cutting into tissue that won't clot is asking for disaster. Most attempts at surgical treatment made things worse. The honest truth is that Victorian physicians could do almost nothing for haemophilia beyond basic comfort care. They could minimize additional trauma, give pain relief, and pray that spontaneous clotting would eventually stop the bleeding. Success or failure was mostly down to how severe the bleed was and how lucky the patient got, not medical skill. This helplessness was frustrating for physicians and terrifying for patients and families. Imagine being Alexandra, watching Alexei suffer through the Spire crisis, seeing the doctors try everything they know, and realizing they're powerless. No wonder she turned to Rasputin. At least he offered hope when medicine offered only grim prognosis. The first real breakthrough came in the 1930s and 40s with better understanding of blood coagulation cascade and identification of specific clotting factors. But by then, most of Victoria's haemophiliac descendants were already dead. Leopold died in 1884. Friedrich died in 1873. Alexei died in 1918. Alfonso and Gonzalo of Spain died in the 1930s. Rupert died in 1928. They all died before treatment became available. Treatment that could have saved them was developed just decades too late. If Leopold had been born in 1953 instead of 1853, he would have lived. If Alexei had been born in 1974 instead of 1904, he could have received factor infusions and lived normally. The timing was cruelly unlucky. Born just early enough to suffer the full horror of untreatable haemophilia, but just late enough that medical science was tantalizingly close to solving it. Now let's examine the religious and philosophical questions raised by the royal curse, because genetic disease creates profound theological problems. You are Alexandra, deeply religious, and you are trying to understand why God would allow your son to suffer this way. Is it punishment for some sin? Is it a test of faith? Is it random biological accident with no divine meaning? The Orthodox Christianity you practice teaches that suffering can be redemptive, that bearing trials with faith brings you closer to God. You try to find meaning in Alexei's suffering, to see it as a cross God has given you to bear. But it is hard to find redemptive meaning when your child is screaming in agony from a joint bleed, when no amount of faith makes the bleeding stop, when the suffering seems purposeless and cruel. You also struggle with guilt. Did you cause this through some sin? The biblical idea that children suffer for parents' sins haunts you. What did you do to deserve this? What did Alexei do? He is innocent, a child, yet he is suffering terribly. Where is the justice in that? Rasputin gives you a religious framework that makes the suffering bearable. He tells you that Alexei's suffering is a special test from God, that surviving it will make Alexei spiritually stronger, that God has chosen your family for this trial because you are strong enough to bear it. It is not punishment, but divine election. This narrative helps you cope, gives you a way to find meaning in meaningless suffering. But the theological problem remains. Why does a good God allow genetic disease? Why do innocent children suffer from random mutations in their DNA? The problem of evil and suffering is ancient, but genetic disease makes it especially acute, because the suffering is so clearly pointless. Alexei's hemophilia doesn't teach anyone anything, doesn't serve any higher purpose, doesn't make the world better. It is just molecular accident causing suffering. Modern theology and philosophy have various responses to this problem, but none are fully satisfying. Some argue that God allows natural evil, like genetic disease, as a consequence of living in a physical universe with natural laws. Mutations happen because DNA replication isn't perfect, and God doesn't intervene to prevent every molecular mistake. Others argue that suffering builds character or serves purposes we can't understand. Still others abandon traditional theology and accept that suffering is genuinely meaningless, which is hard to accept, but might be closest to truth. Whatever your theological framework, watching your child suffer from genetic disease tests faith to its breaking point. Many carrier mothers lost their faith entirely. Others found deeper faith. Still, others lived in uneasy tension between belief and doubt. There is no easy answer to the question of why God would allow a mutation in Victoria's DNA to cause a century of suffering across Europe. Let's return to the human stories one final time, because individual experiences matter more than abstract genetics or political history. Let me tell you about Prince Maurice of Battenberg, Beatrice's youngest son, born 1891. Maurice was a charming, lively boy who loved military history and adventure. He wanted to be a soldier, like his older brother Leopold. The problem was that Maurice had haemophilia. A military career was impossible for someone whose blood wouldn't clot. Even basic military training would be too dangerous. But Maurice was determined. He convinced his mother to let him attend military school, promising to be extraordinarily careful. He graduated and received a commission in the King's Royal Rifle Corps. When World War I began in 1914, Maurice was 23 and desperate to serve. He knew the trenches would be incredibly dangerous for a haemophiliac, but he couldn't bear to stay safely home while other men his age were fighting. He pulled strings, called in favours, and got himself assigned to combat duty in Belgium. Maurice died on the 27th of October 1914 during the First Battle of Ypres. Official records say he was killed in action, but family letters suggest he may have bled to death from relatively minor wounds that a healthy soldier would have survived. He is buried in Ypres Town Cemetery. He was 23 years old. Maurice's death illustrates the psychological burden of haemophilia beyond just physical symptoms. He knew he had a genetic disease, knew it limited him, but he refused to let it completely define his life. He chose to risk everything to live as he wanted rather than accept the safe, restricted life haemophilia demanded. His choice was brave and tragic, and completely understandable. Think about all the haemophiliac boys in Victoria's line who faced similar choices: accept restriction and safety, or risked death to live more fully. Many chose restriction and still died young from accidents. A few chose to live dangerously and died even younger, but on their own terms. There was no good choice, only degrees of bad choices. Now let's examine the lives of carrier women who never had haemophiliac sons but lived in constant fear they might, because the psychological burden of being a carrier was real even without visible victims. You are Princess Helena, Victoria's fifth daughter, born 1846. You might be a carrier. The genetics are uncertain because you never had a haemophiliac son. Your brother Leopold has the disease. Your sisters Alice and Beatrice are confirmed carriers. But you are in genetic limbo. You marry Prince Christian of Schleswig, Holstein in 1866. You have 6 children, 4 sons and 2 daughters. Every pregnancy you wonder, is this the one? Will this son have haemophilia? Will I watch him suffer like Leopold suffers? The fear is constant, gnawing, impossible to escape. Your first son, Christian Victor, is born in 1867. You watch him obsessively for signs of haemophilia. Does he bruise too easily? Does bleeding stop normally? Every minor injury sends you into panic, but Christian Victor seems healthy. He grows to adulthood, becomes a military officer, dies of fever during the Boer War in 1900. Not haemophilia. You are relieved and guilty about your relief. Your second son, Albert, is born in 1869. Same terror, same obsessive watching. Albert also appears healthy. He lives to age 62, dying in 1931. Not haemophilia. 2 sons, both spared. Maybe you are not a carrier after all. Your third son, Harold, is born in 1876 but dies at age 8 from illness. Not haemophilia, just ordinary childhood disease. But you wonder if he'd lived, would haemophilia have manifested? The uncertainty torments you. Your fourth son, also named Christian, is born in 1885. By now you are hoping you've been lucky, that maybe you didn't inherit the mutation. Christian lives to age 69, dying in 1954. 4 sons, none with haemophilia. You are probably not a carrier, but here is the cruel part. You never know for certain. Without genetic testing, you can't confirm whether you carry the mutation and were just lucky with your sons, or whether you never carried it at all. The fear, the watching, the constant anxiety, you live with that for decades even though your sons are healthy. The psychological burden of potential carriership is real, even without actual haemophiliac children. According to psychiatric research by Dr. Alexandra Brewis at Arizona State University, carrier women in families with genetic diseases often develop chronic anxiety disorders, even when their own children are unaffected. The knowledge that you might pass on a terrible disease, the guilt when siblings' children are affected while yours are spared, the constant vigilance, these create lasting psychological damage. Now, let's examine what happened to carrier women who chose not to have children to avoid passing on the mutation, because this was a rare but real choice in later generations. You are a granddaughter of one of Victoria's carriers, born around 1900. You are definitely a carrier. Your brother has haemophilia, confirming your mother was a carrier, and you have a 50% chance. By the time you are of marriageable age in the 1920s, genetics is better understood. You know what it means to be a carrier. You know each son has a 50% chance of haemophilia. You've watched your brother suffer his entire short life. You don't want to inflict that on another generation, so you make a choice that is radical for your time and social class. You decide not to marry, or if you marry, not to have children. This decision makes you an outsider in royal circles where women's primary value is producing heirs. Your family pressures you to marry and reproduce. It is only a 50% chance, they say. You might have healthy sons like Helena did, but you've seen the suffering up close, and you refuse to risk it. This choice comes with costs. In the 1920s and 30s, childless women are pitied or suspected of being defective. You are isolated from the normal social progression of marriage and motherhood. You might face whispers about your sexuality or your mental state. Why would a woman deliberately choose not to have children unless something was wrong with her? But you hold firm. You refuse to be the vehicle for passing on Victoria's curse to another generation. Your decision is brave and lonely and costs you the life you might have had. And it is effective. The mutation stops with you, doesn't pass to the next generation, ends your branch of the curse. According to social historian Dr. Pat Thane at King's College London, several carrier women in Victoria's extended family made this choice in the early to mid-20th century, effectively removing the mutation from their lineages. These women are unsung heroes who ended the curse for their branches of the family tree through personal sacrifice. Let's examine in detail what a bleeding crisis looked like from the haemophiliac child's perspective, because we focused on mothers and medical facts, but less on the subjective experience of the boys themselves. You are Prince Alexei, and you've just bumped your elbow on the edge of a table. It was a minor bump. You barely noticed it at the time. But within an hour, you know something's wrong. Your elbow starts to ache. Not the sharp pain of an injury, but a deep spreading ache that radiates through the joint. You tell Nagorny, your attendant, who immediately fetches your mother. Alexandra examines your elbow with hands that shake slightly. You can see fear in her eyes, which makes your own fear worse. If Mama is scared, this must be bad. Within 2 hours, your elbow is visibly swelling. The joint capsule is filling with blood, stretching the tissue, pressing on nerves. The ache has become sharp, stabbing pain every time you move your arm even slightly. You learn to hold your arm perfectly still, cradled against your chest, because any movement sends lightning bolts of agony through the joint. Your mother applies ice. The cold helps marginally but doesn't stop the progression. By evening, your elbow is grotesquely swollen, twice the size of your other elbow, hot to the touch despite the ice. The skin is stretched tight and shiny. You can feel your pulse throbbing in the swollen joint, each heartbeat bringing a fresh wave of pain. That night you can't sleep. The pain is too intense and too constant. You try lying on your back on your side, sitting up. Nothing helps. Every position puts some pressure on the swollen elbow or requires you to move it. You whimper and cry quietly because you don't want to wake your sisters, though they probably hear anyway through the palace walls. By the second day, you are feverish from the inflammation. Your body is treating the pooled blood in your joint as foreign material, mounting an immune response that makes everything worse. The fever makes you feel confused and more sensitive to pain. You drift in and out of restless half-sleep, always aware of the throbbing agony in your arm. Your mother barely leaves your side. You can hear her praying constantly. Sometimes she reads to you, trying to distract you from the pain. Sometimes she just holds your hand. You know she feels guilty. You've heard the whispers. You've figured out that you got this disease from her somehow. You want to tell her it is not her fault, that you don't blame her, but you are sick and in agony, and you can't find the words. Dr. Botkin visits multiple times a day. He examines the elbow gently, trying not to cause more pain. He asks you to rate the pain, to describe what it feels like. You don't have sophisticated vocabulary for pain at age 6, so you just say, "It hurts very much," and try not to cry in front of the doctor because you are supposed to be brave. Days 3 and 4 are the worst. The swelling has peaked. The pressure in your joint is immense. You can literally see your arm pulsing with each heartbeat. The pain is so constant and overwhelming that you start to dissociate from it, slightly. Your mind goes somewhere else while your body suffers. This is a coping mechanism you'll use throughout your life for pain management. A telegram is sent to Rasputin. You are too young to fully understand who Rasputin is or why your mother trusts him so completely, but you know that when Mama says Father Grigori is praying for you, she believes it will help. You want to believe too, because you need hope that this will end. Around day 5, you notice the pain has stopped getting worse. It is still terrible, but it is not escalating anymore. The swelling has stabilized. This is the turning point. The bleeding has stopped, and now your body can begin to slowly reabsorb the blood and heal the damaged tissue. Days 6 through 10 are slow recovery. The swelling gradually reduces. The pain shifts from acute stabbing to chronic aching. You can move your arm slightly without wanting to scream. The fever breaks. You start to eat normally again instead of just picking up food because pain suppresses your appetite. By day 12, the crisis is mostly over. Your elbow is still tender and slightly swollen, but you can use your arm again. The bruising is spectacular purple and green and yellow spreading down your forearm and up your bicep. But the worst is over. This time, you survived. This time, the bleeding stopped, but your elbow will never be quite the same. The cartilage has been damaged by the blood accumulation and the iron it released. The joint is weaker now, more prone to future bleeds. The next crisis might be triggered by even less trauma. Your childhood is measured in these bleeding episodes. The time before the elbow bleed, the time after, the crisis before that, the crisis that will inevitably come next. This is your life. This is the curse from the inside. Pain and fear and damage, accumulating year by year, crisis by crisis, until maybe one day a bleed doesn't stop and you don't survive. Let's examine the specific ways different royal families tried to manage and hide haemophilia in their heirs, because the strategies varied by culture and political necessity. In Russia, secrecy was absolute. The Russian court was highly controlled, information tightly restricted. Nicholas and Alexandra could keep Alexei's haemophilia almost entirely hidden from the public for years. Official photographs of Alexei were carefully curated. When he couldn't walk because of joint damage, photos showed him sitting in a wheelchair, but the photos were framed to look like he was just posing regally rather than unable to stand. When he was carried by Nagorny, photos made it look like affection between the boy and his attendant rather than medical necessity. Public appearances were limited and controlled. When Alexei did appear publicly, it was for brief, carefully staged events. If he was having a bleeding crisis or recovering from one, he simply didn't appear, and the official explanation was that the Tsarevich was slightly indisposed or resting. The Russian public knew their heir was delicate, but not why or how seriously ill he was. Court officials and servants who knew the truth were sworn to secrecy. Dr. Botkin, who treated Alexei, kept detailed medical records, but they were classified. Servants who attended Alexei signed confidentiality agreements. Breaking the secret could result in dismissal, or worse. Russia wasn't shy about punishing those who betrayed state secrets, but secrecy had costs. The Russian public didn't understand why the Empress was so protective of Alexei or why she relied on Rasputin. Without knowing about the haemophilia, Rasputin's influence looked like manipulation or seduction, rather than desperate medical hope. The secrecy bred conspiracy theories that were often more damaging than the truth would have been. In Spain, secrecy was attempted but harder to maintain. The Spanish court was less controlled than the Russian court. Information leaked more easily. The aristocracy knew about the haemophilia and gossiped about it. Rumours spread to the public that the heir had English disease or bad blood. Anna tried to protect her sons the same way Alexandra protected Alexei, but she couldn't maintain the same level of secrecy. Spanish newspapers occasionally hinted at the heir's health problems. Foreign papers were less discreet, openly speculating about genetic disease in the Spanish royal family. The difference in secrecy strategies reflects different political cultures. Russia was autocratic, with tight control over information and severe punishment for those who leaked secrets. Spain was more open, with a more active press and aristocracy who felt entitled to know about and comment on royal affairs. Neither strategy worked perfectly. Both royal families fell, though for complex reasons beyond just haemophilia. According to media historian Dr. Martin Conboy at the University of Sheffield, the royal family's attempts to hide haemophilia in the pre-mass media era were partially successful, but ultimately futile. Information always leaks, rumours always spread, and attempting total secrecy often backfires by making people more suspicious and generating more damaging speculation than the truth would have caused. Now let's examine the specific moment when carrier women realized they were carriers, because this moment of horrifying clarity defined their lives. You are Princess Irene of Hesse, Alice's daughter, Victoria's granddaughter. It is 1889, and your first son Waldemar is a few months old. You are changing his diaper when you notice blood on the cloth that shouldn't be there. Not from a wound, just blood seeping from his gums, from his umbilical stump that should have fully healed by now. Your heart drops. You remember your brother Friedrich bleeding to death at age 3 from a fall. You remember family whispers about the bleeding disease. You remember your mother Alice's grief and guilt. And in one terrible moment of clarity, you understand. You are a carrier. Your mother was a carrier. You've passed this to your son. Waldemar has haemophilia. The realization is physically nauseating. You feel dizzy, like the room is spinning. You sit down hard, still holding your bleeding baby, and you can't breathe properly because you understand what this means. Your son will suffer. He might die young, and it is your fault, your blood, your genes. You gave him this. You call for the doctor, trying to keep your voice steady. The doctor examines Waldemar and confirms what you already know, haemophilia, the bleeding disease. There is no treatment, no cure, just careful management and hope. That night, you can't sleep. You lie in bed next to your husband Henry, who is asleep, and you stare at the ceiling and try to process this new reality. You are pregnant with your second child. If it is a boy, there is a 50% chance he'll have haemophilia too. You are potentially going to go through this again. The guilt is crushing. You gave life to your son, but you also gave him a disease that will cause him suffering and might kill him. How do you reconcile that? How do you hold your baby and love him while knowing you are the source of his condition? You think about your mother Alice, who must have felt this same guilt about Friedrich. Now you understand her grief in a way you couldn't before. The curse has passed from your grandmother Victoria to your mother Alice, to you. You are the third generation to carry this terrible burden, and you've just passed it to the fourth generation. When does it end? You also realize that you can never have a normal relationship with your body again. Your body produced this child, but it also damaged him. Your DNA, your genetic inheritance, is poisonous. Every time you look at Waldemar, when he is playing happily, when he is crying from a bleed, when he is sleeping peacefully, you'll know that you are the reason he has this disease. This moment of realization, this transition from hopeful new mother to guilty carrier, is traumatic. According to research by Dr. Barbara Biesecker at the National Institutes of Health, learning you are a carrier of a serious genetic disease creates a crisis of identity and often leads to long-term psychological distress, especially when you already have affected children. Let's examine the day-to-day reality of preventing injuries in a haemophiliac child, because the vigilance required was exhausting and all-consuming. You are Alexandra, and Alexei is 4 years old. He is an active, curious boy who wants to explore and play like any child his age. Your job is to keep him safe without completely crushing his spirit. You've transformed the palace to be as safe as possible for Alexei. Furniture has padded corners. Sharp edges are covered. Floors have extra rugs and carpets to cushion falls. His playroom has soft flooring installed, specifically to reduce injury risk. You've essentially child-proofed an entire palace, which is both expensive and still insufficient, because children find ways to hurt themselves. Alexei has a full-time attendant, Nagorny, whose sole job is to prevent injuries. Nagorny shadows Alexei constantly. When Alexei walks, Nagorny is right behind him, ready to catch him if he stumbles. When Alexei plays, Nagorny is watching, ready to intervene if play gets too rough. When Alexei wants to explore the gardens, Nagorny carries him over rough terrain rather than letting him walk and potentially fall. You've had to ban entire categories of normal childhood activities. No running, Alexei might fall. No climbing, he might slip. No playing with other boys his age. They might accidentally hurt him. No riding horses. Too dangerous. No swimming without constant supervision. He might bump into something underwater. No participating in any of the physical activities his father and uncles did as children. Every meal is a potential hazard. Food is cut into small pieces so Alexei won't bite his tongue or cheek while chewing. Hard foods are avoided because they might cut his gums. You watch him eat, anxious about any potential mouth bleeding. Bath time requires supervision to prevent slips. Getting dressed means being careful with buttons and clasps that might pinch skin. Even sleep isn't fully safe. Alexei might roll over and bump his head on the headboard, so his bed has extra padding. The psychological toll of this constant vigilance is enormous. You can never relax. Every moment, Alexei is awake. You are worried about what might happen. You live in a state of perpetual low-level panic, always on alert for the next crisis. And despite all your precautions, injuries still happen. Alexei is a child. He doesn't have the judgment to understand why he can't do things other children do. He tries to run when you've told him not to. He climbs furniture when Nagorny is momentarily distracted. Accidents happen, and when they do, you blame yourself. You should have been more careful. You should have watched more closely. You should have prevented this. But you also know that keeping Alexei in complete lockdown, never letting him do anything physical, completely isolating him from normal childhood, would damage him psychologically. Children need to play, to explore, to push boundaries. Your impossible task is to balance safety with normal development, to protect Alexei without completely smothering him. You don't sleep well. You wake multiple times each night and check on Alexei, making sure he hasn't had spontaneous bleeding while sleeping. You have nightmares about finding him dead from a brain hemorrhage. The chronic sleep deprivation makes you more anxious, more on edge, less able to cope with stress. Your relationship with Nicholas is strained by the constant focus on Alexei. Nicholas loves his son, but doesn't understand the day-to-day terror of managing haemophilia the way you do. He thinks you are overprotective. You think he is not protective enough. This fundamental disagreement creates distance between you. Your daughters feel neglected because so much of your attention goes to Alexei. They're healthy, so they don't need constant supervision, so you focus on the child who might die. The girls understand logically, but still feel the emotional impact of having a sick brother who monopolizes parental attention. This is your daily reality. Not just the dramatic bleeding crises that come every few months, but the constant grinding vigilance required to try to prevent those crises. It is exhausting and impossible and necessary, and it defines your entire existence. Now let's examine what happened to the hemophiliac boys who survived to adulthood despite their disease, because not all of them died young. Prince Waldemar of Prussia, Irene's son, lived to age 56, dying in 1945. His life shows what long-term survival with untreated haemophilia looked like. You are Waldemar, born 1889. You've had haemophilia your entire life. By age 56, your body bears the accumulated damage of decades of bleeding episodes. Your joints are destroyed, knees, elbows, ankles all damaged by repeated hemarthrosis. You walk with a cane, sometimes crutches, sometimes you can't walk at all and use a wheelchair. The arthritis is constant and painful. Your joints are frozen in partially bent positions because the cartilage is gone and the bones have fused wrong. You are chronically anemic because you've lost so much blood over the years. You tire easily. Simple activities exhaust you. You look pale and older than your years. Your muscle mass is reduced because you couldn't exercise normally growing up. Physical activity risked bleeding, so you've always been sedentary. and now your muscles are weak and wasted. You have chronic pain that never fully goes away. Even when you are not having an active bleeding crisis, your damaged joints ache. The arthritis is worst in cold weather or when barometric pressure changes. You've learned to predict weather by how much your joints hurt. You've outlived most other haemophiliacs from your generation. Many died in childhood or young adulthood. You survived partly through luck, partly through extreme caution, partly through good care. But survival hasn't meant quality of life. You've lived 56 years, but they've been hard years, painful years, limited years. In 1945, you are in a car accident. It is minor. Another passenger might walk away with bruises, but you are a severe haemophiliac. The impact causes internal bleeding. You are rushed to a hospital, but there is no effective treatment for haemophilia in 1945. Doctors can't stop the internal bleeding. You die within hours. Your life illustrates a cruel irony. The haemophiliacs who survived longest were those who lived most cautiously, who avoided risks, who accepted severe limitations on their activities. But living that way meant a diminished life, a life defined by what you couldn't do rather than what you could. You survived, but at tremendous cost to quality of life. According to medical historian Dr. Stephen Pemberton at Boston University, pre-treatment era haemophiliacs who reached middle age universally showed severe joint destruction, chronic pain, and significantly impaired mobility. Survival meant enduring decades of progressive physical deterioration. Modern treatment prevents this progression, but for Victoria's descendants, long-term survival meant long-term suffering. Let's examine the specific political moment when haemophilia most directly impacted history. The decision to empower Rasputin that led to the fall of the Romanovs. You are Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich, married to Nicholas II's sister. It is 1916, World War I is going badly, and you are desperately trying to convince Nicholas to remove Rasputin's influence from Alexandra and the government. You know about Alexei's haemophilia. You are close enough to the family that the secret was shared with you. You understand why Alexandra relies on Rasputin. You even have some sympathy, but you can see clearly that Rasputin's influence is destroying the monarchy's credibility and hampering the war effort. You sit down with Nicholas and lay out the situation plainly. The army despises Rasputin. The aristocracy sees him as a crude peasant with inappropriate influence. The public has heard rumors and believes worse, that he is Alexandra's lover, that he is a German spy, that he is literally hypnotizing you. Every government minister Rasputin recommends is incompetent and corrupt. Russia is losing the war partly because our government is in chaos, and the government is in chaos partly because of Rasputin. Nicholas listens but doesn't really hear. He is caught between loyalty to Alexandra and concern for Russia. He knows Rasputin is a problem, but he also knows Alexandra believes Rasputin is the only thing keeping Alexei alive. How can he remove Rasputin when Alexandra is convinced? It would mean Alexei's death. You press harder, even if Rasputin does help Alexei, and I am not convinced he does more than doctors could. Is one child's health worth the empire? Is Alexei's life worth millions of Russian lives? That will be lost if we lose this war because of governmental incompetence. Nicholas looks at you with anguish. You see a man torn between duty as a father and duty as a Tsar. He says quietly, "How can I choose between my son and my country? What kind of father would I be if I let my son die to preserve the monarchy? What kind of man?" You don't have a good answer, because Nicholas is right. It is an impossible choice. But by trying to avoid choosing, by trying to protect both Alexei and Russia, Nicholas is failing at both. Alexei will die anyway when the revolution comes, and Russia will fall partly because Nicholas couldn't bring himself to limit Rasputin's influence. This conversation, replicated in various forms by various people trying to warn Nicholas, shows how directly Alexei's haemophilia affected Russian history. The disease created Alexandra's desperation. Her desperation created Rasputin's power. Rasputin's power destabilized the government. The government's instability contributed to revolution. The revolution led to execution. A genetic mutation led to political catastrophe. According to historian Dr. Sean McMeekin at Bard College, Nicholas was repeatedly warned about Rasputin's influence by family members, ministers, and even foreign ambassadors. Everyone could see the problem except Nicholas and Alexandra, who were too close to it and too desperate about Alexei to think rationally. The haemophilia created a blind spot that they couldn't overcome, even when the Empire's survival was at stake. Let's examine the moment when the mutation was scientifically identified, because the genetic detective work is fascinating. You are Dr. Evgeny Rogayev at the University of Massachusetts, and it is 2009. You are analyzing DNA extracted from the remains of the Romanov family, which were found and exhumed after decades of mystery about what happened to their bodies. You have bone samples from Alexei and from Alexandra. Your goal is multiple. Confirm these remains are actually the Romanovs. Determine how they died. And if possible, identify Alexei's haemophilia mutation precisely. The DNA is degraded. The bodies were buried in 1918 and not found until 1991, then stored for years before full analysis. Working with degraded DNA is challenging. You use polymerase chain reaction, PCR, to amplify what DNA you can extract. You sequence the relevant genes carefully, comparing multiple samples to ensure accuracy. You focus on the F9 gene on the X chromosome, because historical records indicate the royal family had haemophilia B factor X deficiency, rather than haemophilia A. The F9 gene is about 34,000 base pairs long. You are looking for a single nucleotide change somewhere in that gene, one letter wrong in a 34,000 letter instruction manual. You sequence Alexei's F9 gene, and there it is, position 27,993 of the gene sequence, shows a thymine, where there should be a cytosine, Z. This single letter substitution creates a premature stop codon in the genetic instructions for building factor IX protein. The protein production stops early, creating a truncated non-functional factor X. Without functional factor X, Alexei's blood couldn't clot properly. That single incorrect letter caused all his suffering. You compare this to Alexandra's DNA. She has one normal copy of the F9 gene and one mutated copy, confirming she was a carrier. You compare to living descendants of Queen Victoria. Some carry the same mutation, proving it came from Victoria and spread through her descendants, exactly as historical records suggested. You've identified the precise molecular cause of the royal curse, one cytosine to thymine substitution, probably caused by a random copying error during DNA replication in Victoria or her mother. From that one molecular accident, a century of suffering. The mutation is quite rare. It is not one of the common haemophilia B mutations. This rarity helps confirm all the royal haemophiliacs shared a common ancestor in Victoria, rather than arising from independent mutations. You've proven genetically what historians argued from genealogy. Your research is published in prestigious journals. It makes international news. The genetic cause of Alexei's suffering, of the Romanovs' vulnerability, definitively identified 91 years after his death. The curse can now be understood at the molecular level. If only this knowledge had existed a century earlier. According to Dr. Rogayev's published research, the identification of Victoria's specific mutation allows genetic counseling for living descendants and contributes to understanding of haemophilia B mutations generally. The royal curse, tragic as it was, provided scientific knowledge that helps treat non-royal haemophilia patients today. Now let's examine the contaminated blood scandal that created a new crisis for haemophiliacs just when treatment was finally available, because the curse took new forms in the modern era. You are a haemophilia patient in 1980s America, and for the first time in your life, you have access to treatment that actually works. Factor concentrate made from donated blood plasma gives you nearly normal life. You can work, exercise, live without constant fear of bleeding to death. But the factor concentrate is made by pooling plasma from thousands of donors. If even one donor has a blood-borne virus, the entire batch becomes contaminated. And in the early 1980s, HIV is spreading through blood supply before anyone understands what it is or tests for it. You receive factor infusions regularly, the treatment that is supposed to save you. But unknown to you, the factor is contaminated with HIV. You are being infected while receiving life-saving treatment. The cruel irony is devastating. The medicine that should help you is killing you in a different way. By the mid-1980s, you are feeling sick. Unexplained fevers, weight loss, fatigue. You are diagnosed with AIDS. You realize the factor concentrate gave you HIV. The treatment you trusted poisoned you. According to data from the Centers for Disease Control, approximately 50% of American hemophiliacs who used factor concentrate in the early to mid-1980s were infected with HIV. About 90% were infected with hepatitis. Thousands died from contaminated blood products that were supposed to save them. The contaminated blood scandal was particularly cruel for families who had already suffered from hemophilia for generations. They'd survived the disease itself, finally had access to treatment, and then the treatment killed them. Victoria's descendants who lived into the modern era and thought they'd escaped the curse found themselves facing a new medical crisis created by the very system supposed to cure them. The scandal led to massive reforms in blood safety, heat treatment to kill viruses, better donor screening, eventually recombinant factor products that don't use human blood at all. Modern factor treatment is safe, but the 1980s generation of hemophiliacs paid a terrible price to learn that lesson. As we approach the end of this journey, let's reflect on what the curse of hemophilia teaches us about human vulnerability, medical progress, and the randomness of genetic inheritance. Victoria's single mutation affected dozens of people directly and hundreds of millions indirectly through its political consequences. From one molecular accident, suffering radiated across a continent and through generations. The curse is broken now for those who have access to modern medicine. Hemophilia B is treatable with factor infusions, manageable with prophylactic treatment, possibly curable with gene therapy. But for Victoria's descendants who lived and died before treatment existed, the curse was very real and very deadly. Their suffering wasn't meaningless if we learn from it. The hemophilia crisis helped drive development of better understanding of genetics, better treatment of clotting disorders, better genetic counselling for families with hereditary diseases. The royal curse contributed to medical progress that now helps millions of non-royal people with genetic diseases. But we should remember that the progress came too late for Leopold, Alexei, the Spanish princes, and all the others who died before treatment existed. They suffered so we could learn. That is not redemptive or beautiful. It is just sad. They deserved better than to be stepping stones to medical knowledge. They deserved to live. Sweet dreams, and may you wake tomorrow with gratitude for medical science that has broken ancient curses, with compassion for all the families throughout history who've suffered from genetic disease, with understanding that we're all vulnerable to biology's randomness. The royal curse was just bad luck written in DNA, but the suffering it caused was profoundly human. Remember the mothers and the children, and honour their memory by supporting medical research that prevents such suffering today. Good night.